All right. So I'm coming at you with question two. Niklaus Cooper, a friend of mine from Facebook, actually asked me this question. He wanted to know if I smoked after sex, and actually, I think I read that wrong. He wanted to know, where do you think psychology will go in this century? Where should it go? Where do you expect it to go? And what problems will they face? Um, Now, this is actually a really good question. Psychology, at least in the last century, went through a lot of changes. A lot of people are aware of that. I think my interests are mainly in historical psychical research and things like that. So, and also the convergence with psychology and what it is today. So, I think historical psychical research was actually considered, or at least the people who were doing psychical research originally considered it a type of psychology. They thought they were doing psychological research, and they were really, because back then the lines that kind of divide, I guess, parapsychology and psychology weren't really dead set. A lot of people didn't know what would make a scientific psychology. They didn't know what should constitute that. And then, Freud came along with his theories, and Jung, who expanded on them. Then you had, after the psychoanalysts, you had the behavioral psychology, and B.F. Skinner and the people who were involved in that movement, and that was very influential on mainstream science for a long time. And then after that, you had the computational models of mind entering into the foray, and people starting to really dig into neuroscience. And as far as where I think psychology will go, I think in the next few decades, I think mostly we're going to be looking at the same things we've been looking at. We're going to be looking at correlates between brain states and mental states. And, it's nothing really new. I mean, back in William James's day, he admitted, that everyone knows that, if you hit someone over the head with something and damage the brain, then their personality changes and whatnot. But there are multiple ways of looking at it. You can look at it under the production concept. You can look at it under the transmission concept. You can look at it under the permissive concept. And there's three different ways of looking at the mind and brain, or the relationship between mind and brain. So, but at the same time, I really think that in the next few decades, psychology, cognitive psychology, is going to be focusing specifically and mostly on analyzing correlations between, the brain and brain activity and mental phenomena, mental states. And I think the ultimate question on where it should go is subjective, but the ultimate question about the problems they'll face, that was another question. One of the problems they'll face is accounting for all the data. Now, I think whether we end up following the materialistic and reductionist paradigm that we're in now depends on how well it can account for the data. I think eventually there's going to have to be some sort of convergence. I think eventually, if it proves that the reductionist models can't account for all the data, then we're going to have to move to something else. And there are different ways of looking at the mind-brain relationship. And I've got a cold now, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But there are different ways of looking at the mind-brain relationship, and whichever one proves to be correct, or I guess wherever the data start leading, whichever ideas can't account for the data that well, and the more that awareness grows, I think the more that mainstream science and mainstream psychology are going to shift in that direction. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get past the materialistic, or purely materialistic framework. A lot of writers have already written that about the apparent irreducible nature of consciousness. And a lot of philosophers particularly have done that. But in philosophy and psychology, they don't have to be that different. Actually, I think psychology and philosophy, they in some ways we're asking some of the same questions in different ways. But I think wherever the data really leads, if in parapsychology, for example, you had J.B. Rhine, and well, first you had the early psychical researchers, then you had J.B. Rhine and the Gansfeld paradigm, and well, you had a lot of stuff in between that, and now you've got the stuff we're doing today. But with Rhine and whatnot, and even before that, with the early psychical researchers, for example, when the SPR was first founded and Phantasms of the Living was published, a lot of people were hoping, and especially SPR members, they thought that telepathy was demonstrated based on the evidence from Phantasms of the Living and the later Census of Hallucinations. And also, I believe that those studies were the first ones to really demonstrate that sane people, regular people, had very, very strong hallucinatory phenomena, phantasms, at a very, very frequent level. And people back then didn't expect that. That was supposedly a sign of mental degradation, a sign of like mental disorders and whatnot. And the fact that sane, regular people were having hallucinations and often corresponding with the time someone died was fascinating back then. And psychical research was on a much firmer footing back in those days. It was a much more popular area of inquiry, mainly because they didn't know where psychology was going to go, and now we know where it went. But with J.B. Rhine, and I think J.B. Rhine actually probably did a disservice to psychical research in some ways, with the approach he adopted. But at the same time, it did provide a great deal of evidence for psychic phenomena. And the only thing we can do now is question the veracity of the evidence and whether or not it was good enough, whether or not there were flaws. But not getting into that, it almost took off. Parapsychology was on a much, much firmer footing back in the day. It almost became a mainstream subject of study, I'd say. Back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with J.B. Rhine, a lot of people were talking about that stuff. It was very popular. And in hindsight, I'd say parapsychology was much, much more popular back then. And then you had the Gansfeld paradigm, and it almost took off again. We almost got mainstream respectability then, or a lot of parapsychologists did, especially in the 80s and 90s. It was still very controversial, but I think more people were looking into the things because a lot of people were really interested in it and whatnot. And a lot of people still are, but I think we have different periods where we almost take off and then it just doesn't quite work out. So maybe the best thing for parapsychology is to actually become a part of psychology, for psychology to actually be doing this research. Because personally, I don't really consider parapsychology and psychology to be different fields. I consider parapsychology to be an extension of psychology. And really, it is psychological research. And there are also other fields that converge into it, but predominantly I'd say it's a psychological inquiry. But yeah, mainly with psychology, I expect it to focus on, in the next few decades, to focus on looking for correlates and trying to establish relationships and maybe even trying to reduce consciousness on some fundamental level. And they haven't really been that successful with that so far, which is interesting. But I think that the only way they're going to move on, or anyone is going to move on, is if they find out that the theories or hypotheses are actually inadequate. And if they do come to that conclusion, then we can expect a change. But otherwise, things are going to continue like they have. But with that said, you did have a lot of changes in psychology last century, so I expect the same thing to happen this century. Expect a lot of changes, and really, hopefully, people going with the data. If it proves that consciousness isn't reducible, and the evidence tends to suggest that we aren't limited to our brain, then I think psychology will expand and accept that eventually. And that's a very optimistic view, but I think eventually, it may not be anytime soon, but eventually, if that proves to be the case, I mean, they're going to have to go through a lot of obstacles to get there, but and a lot of resistance. But if that proves to be the case, science is going to have to accept it. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, but eventually, I think the data will take us where we need to be. And those are my thoughts. This was longer than I actually intended it to be, but I think I covered all my bases. So, again, if you have any questions, any new questions you'd like for me to make in video responses like this, ask them and I'll make the responses. I'll respond to your questions. Just comment or send me a message on YouTube. And there you go.